Daniel stood on the edge of the launch platform, his eyes fixed on the sky above. The air around him was filled with the hum of engines and the low voices of men and women preparing for departure. The call had gone out across the stars, a challenge that would test the strength of every people known. Few believed that humans could endure it. Yet here he was, ready to carry the weight of his world on his shoulders. He thought of his family, of his town, and of the queen who had spoken before the gathered crowd days earlier. Her words had been simple but strong, that humanity would not bow before any trial, no matter how great. Laura stood beside him, calm and sharp. While Daniel had been chosen for his courage and strength, Laura had been chosen for her mind. She studied every detail of the trial ahead, memorizing patterns, numbers, and tactics. She knew that brains would win battles just as much as muscle. She watched the others around her, the chosen men and women who would stand with them. None of them had ever faced what was waiting, but every face carried the same fire. They had grown up on a world that tested them daily, and that had forged them into something stronger than they themselves understood. The signal came. Engines roared as the first ships lifted into the air. Daniel tightened his grip on the strap of his pack and followed the others inside. The walls of the craft shook as they left the ground behind. Through a small window, he saw the earth fall away, the blue fading into black. His heart pounded, but he did not feel fear. He felt pride. Humanity had been underestimated for too long. The galaxy would see the truth. When they reached the station that marked the beginning of the trials, Daniel stepped out onto the metal deck. The place was massive, with platforms stretching far and wide, filled with men and women from across the stars. Some looked at the humans with curiosity, others with scorn. Whispers ran through the crowd, dismissing them as fragile, weak, and unworthy. Daniel ignored the looks. He had nothing to prove to those who doubted him. He had only to prove something to himself and to his people. Laura stood close, her eyes scanning the scene. She noted the layout, the order of trials, the groups forming ranks. Everything here was built to break those who entered, to push them until they collapsed. She leaned closer to Daniel and said quietly that this was not only about strength, it was about outlasting and outthinking. He nodded, trusting her judgment as much as his own resolve. The first challenge was called. The crowd grew silent as men and women from different groups stepped forward. It was a test of endurance, a trial through brutal terrain under crushing weight. Daniel was among the first to enter. The path ahead was nothing like the fields and streets of home. It was jagged rock, burning winds, and endless obstacles. But to him, it felt familiar. Earth had raised him on storms, heat, and hardship. He moved with steady steps, refusing to slow. Others stumbled. Some gave up early, unable to push forward under the strain. Daniel pressed on, his breath steady, his eyes fixed forward. Each step carried the voice of his queen, the faith of his people, and the strength of his world. Laura watched from the command platform, tracking his progress, sending signals to help guide him through the worst paths. Together, they showed a bond of will and reason, the blend of heart and mind that made them unshakable. By the time Daniel crossed the finish line, the silence of disbelief filled the air. He had not only endured, but had finished among the first. Laura allowed herself the faintest smile, knowing this was only the beginning. Around them, whispers spread quickly, voices of surprise turning into unease. The humans were not breaking, they were rising. For the first time, others began to wonder if the Deathworlders were far more dangerous than they had ever believed. Daniel stood in the preparation hall, his muscles still aching from the first trial. Around him, the air was heavy with tension. Men and women spoke in low voices, some defeated already, others clinging to hope. He knew the second stage would not be easier. If anything, it would demand more. The hall shook with the sound of heavy gates opening, calling the next group forward. Daniel glanced at Laura, who stood over a table filled with maps and data screens. Her eyes were sharp, her mind already several steps ahead. Laura motioned him closer and spoke in a steady tone. She told him that this challenge would not only test strength, but also the ability to adapt. The terrain was built to shift, the obstacles designed to confuse. She urged him to watch for patterns and not rely only on force. Daniel nodded. He trusted her judgment. He had seen her find order where others only saw chaos. He would need that now. The gates opened wide, and the crowd outside fell silent. The path stretched forward, a maze of stone walls, shifting platforms, and crushing weight machines. Some of the other competitors hesitated, unsure how to begin. Daniel did not wait. He stepped forward with a steady pace, his eyes scanning for openings. He carried the lessons of Earth with him, where every forest, mountain, and storm had been a teacher. Where others saw danger, he saw challenge. The first section demanded balance. Long beams stretched across pits that seemed endless. Men and women faltered, some falling, some retreating in fear. Daniel spread his arms and walked with careful steps. The beams swayed under his weight, but he did not slow. Each movement was measured, controlled, just as Laura had advised. When he reached the other side, his chest rose with steady breath. He did not look back. The second section shifted underfoot. Platforms moved without warning, forcing competitors to leap or fall. Daniel studied the rhythm, watching how each platform slid and returned. He timed his steps, crossing with precision. Others rushed and slipped into the gaps, their cries echoing in the vast hall. Laura watched from the command platform, recording every move. She saw Daniel's patience, his ability to learn faster than those around him, and she knew that was the key to survival. The third section tested raw strength. Heavy blocks had to be lifted and carried across a field of rising dust. Each block seemed too much for the men and women who tried, but Daniel bent his knees, tightened his grip, and carried the weight forward. His arms shook, his back strained, but he did not release it. He thought of his queen, who had stood tall before her people, and of the promise she had made that humanity would not bend. With each step, he kept that promise alive. By the time Daniel crossed the final line, his body was drenched in sweat, his arms trembling. He dropped the weight with a heavy thud, standing tall even as pain ran through him. The crowd erupted in noise, some voices filled with disbelief, others with a strange respect. Laura stood with her arms folded, her mind racing. She knew this was not only about Daniel. Every success, every victory, was changing how the galaxies saw their kind. Others soon followed, but none with the same steady control or strength. Some stumbled through, others gave up, unable to face the trial to its end. Daniel watched them with quiet eyes, not mocking, not proud, only resolved. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more trials, harsher and crueler than this. But he also knew something greater. He was not alone. Lara was guiding him, the Queen was watching, and his people were behind him. Together, they carried the weight of a world, and step by step, they were proving what it meant to be human. The air inside the war hall was thick with pressure. The first two trials had tested the body and mind, but the third trial was built for war. Rows of men and women stood ready, their armor tightened, their weapons shining under harsh lights. This was no simple contest. It was a full battle simulation that would decide who had the strength and wisdom to command. Daniel gripped his weapon with steady hands, while Laura stood behind him at the command post, her eyes scanning the maps laid before her. They both knew this was where many would fall. A voice rang out, calling the start. The vast floor of the war hall shifted, opening into wide fields, broken towers, and shadowed trenches. Daniel moved quickly, leading his small group forward, did not wait for others to act. His instinct was to push ahead, to strike first and claim ground. The men and women at his side followed without question, their trust in him clear with every step. They were outnumbered, but numbers alone had never stopped him. Laura's voice came through the small speaker at his side. She directed him left toward the cover of a ridge, warning of an ambush forming ahead. Daniel obeyed at once, guiding his squad into better ground. From there, they struck with sudden force, catching their rivals by surprise. The clash was fierce. Blades and blasts filled the air, but Daniel did not break. He fought with the same strength that had carried him through storms back on Earth. Each strike was precise, each movement filled with willpower. He knew he could not fall. Too much rested on his survival. On the command level, Laura tracked every move. She shifted pieces on the board with quick hands, marking weak points in enemy lines. She sent coded signals to Daniel, guiding him through traps and into openings. Where others saw chaos, she saw patterns. Where others hesitated, she acted. Her calm orders kept Daniel alive and gave his squad the advantage they needed. As the battle dragged on, the floor of the hall shifted again, reshaping into narrow streets and high walls. Daniel adapted without pause. He used the walls as cover, luring enemies into tight corners where his small squad could strike and vanish. The rivals grew frustrated, unable to pin him down. Their larger numbers turned into a weakness as they crowded into spaces too small to move freely. Daniel's squad cut through them with sharp strikes, then melted back into the shadows. Laura saw the chance for a greater blow. She directed Daniel toward a tower that overlooked the field. If they could hold it, they could control the fight. Daniel climbed with his squad, forcing his way past defenders and claiming the high ground. From above, they rained down fire, breaking the enemy ranks. The crowd watching from beyond the walls erupted in shouts, shocked at the sight of a small human squad turning the tide against a greater force. Yet the battle was not done. A wave of fighters pressed toward the tower, determined to crush them. Daniel stood at the front, refusing to give ground. His squad fought at his side, their faces set with the same unyielding fire. Laura called out the positions of each attacker, her voice steady, never wavering. Daniel listened, moving with her words, striking where she guided, holding the line where she demanded. When the final horn sounded, the floor froze, the simulation ending at last. Daniel stood tall, his chest heaving, his body bruised but unbroken. Around him lay the signs of victory. His squad had held, his strategy had worked, and his people had survived. Laura stepped down from the command post, her eyes meeting his. Neither spoke at first, but both understood. They had turned the impossible into triumph. The crowd was no longer whispering. Now they roared, their disbelief turning into awe. For the first time, men and women across the stars began to see what it meant to face those born on Earth. The Deathworlders were not only enduring, they were winning. The fourth trial was meant to break them. The hall was larger than before, its floor stretching into a wasteland of shifting sand, jagged cliffs, and heavy storms of dust that cut the air. It was not a simple contest or even a battle. It was survival against overwhelming odds. Men and women from across the stars stood ready, but their eyes were wary. Many had already failed in earlier trials, and those who remained were tired, shaken, and unsure. Daniel looked across the field and saw endless lines of enemy fighters forming, far greater in number than his small squad. For a moment, the weight pressed against his chest, but he did not let it stay. He lifted his weapon and steadied his breath. He would not retreat. Laura stood at the command post above, her eyes fixed on the shifting maps. The field was a trap, built to crush smaller groups beneath a tide of enemies. She understood the design, saw the intent behind every detail. It was meant to force surrender. But surrender was not in her nature. She knew it was not in Daniel's. She began marking routes across the map, searching for ways to turn the trap back on those who set it. The signal came, and the waves of fighters advanced. Dust rose into the air, cloaking the battlefield. Daniel led his squad straight into the storm. His men and women moved with him, their faith bound to his will. The first clash came fast, blades meeting in sparks, shouts echoing in the wind. Daniel fought at the front, cutting a path with unshaken resolve. His squad moved behind him, striking with precision, never faltering. From above, Laura's voice reached him through the speaker. She directed him toward the cliffs, telling him the high ground would be the only chance to survive the endless wave. Daniel obeyed, guiding his squad through narrow gaps, holding lines long enough to escape before pulling back again. He fought not to win each skirmish, but to keep moving, step by step, toward the ground Laura promised would save them. The climb up the cliffs was brutal. Enemy forces pressed close, throwing everything they had to drag the humans down. Stones slipped underfoot, weapons clashed at their backs, but Daniel did not break. He pulled men and women up with his own hands, refusing to leave anyone behind. Every shout of pain, every cry of strain, only pushed him harder. The memory of his queen's words burned in his mind that humanity would never bow. At last they reached the top, their breaths ragged, their bodies worn. From there they turned, holding the line against the enemy below. Laura gave orders with sharp precision, placing Daniel's squad at points where the cliffs narrowed, where the enemy could only attack in small numbers. Each push was met with steel and fire, each wave broken on the resolve of those who refused to yield. The enemy grew frustrated. Their numbers should have been enough to crush a force so small, yet every attack ended in failure. Daniel's squad stood as a wall, unshaken by fear, unbroken by exhaustion. Laura's commands guided them through each moment, her mind turning the impossible into strategy. The battlefield itself began to shift, storms tearing across the sands below, cutting off enemy ranks and isolating their forces. Laura had seen it coming and had led Daniel into the one place where the storm would shield them instead of destroy them. When the final horn echoed across the wasteland, Daniel lowered his weapon at last. The enemy ranks fell back, defeated. The squad stood bloodied but alive, their eyes burning with the fire of victory. Laura stepped down from the command post, meeting Daniel's gaze across the distance. Neither spoke, but they knew the truth. They had faced the breaking point and had not shattered. The crowd outside the hall was silent at first, stunned by what they had witnessed. What was meant to crush humanity had instead revealed their strength. The Deathworlders had embraced the storm and turned it into triumph. The final trial was called before a gathering larger than any that had come before. The hall had been opened wide so that countless men and women could watch. The Queen herself stood on a high platform, her presence commanding the silence of the crowd. She spoke with clear words, declaring that her people would fight not for conquest but for honor. Her voice carried across the vast chamber, strong and unshaken. Daniel listened to her speech and felt his chest tighten with pride. Every word reminded him why he had endured, why he had fought, and why he could not fail now. Laura stood at the command station once more, her eyes locked on the shifting maps that displayed the field. This was not a test of small battles or survival against traps. This was the grand trial, a clash against the greatest coalition gathered. Every rival force had joined together, forming an army meant to bury humanity beneath sheer numbers. It was not fair, but fairness had never been promised. What mattered was resolve. The signal rang out, and the floor of the hall transformed into a battlefield wider than any before. Towers, trenches, and open plains stretched into the distance. The rival forces advanced in lines so vast they seemed endless. Daniel stood at the front of his squad, his weapon ready, his jaw set, turned once to look at his men and women, saw the fire in their eyes, and knew they were with him to the very end. Laura's voice reached him, calm but urgent. She gave orders to spread the squad thin, to use speed instead of strength, to strike where the enemy was weak, and vanish before they could strike back. Daniel obeyed without question. They moved like shadows across the battlefield, striking at the edges of the great army, cutting lines and breaking formations. The rival forces grew frustrated, unable to trap them. The battle stretched on, wave after wave of attackers pressing in. Daniel fought at the front, his strength holding against all who came near. His weapon clashed again and again, his body bruised and cut, but he did not fall. Each strike was made not only with muscle, but with spirit, the spirit of a man who carried the weight of his people. Laura directed his moves with sharp commands, guiding him to places where his squad could turn the enemy against themselves. Traps were sprung, ambushes reversed, and slowly the tide began to shift. The Queen watched from above, her eyes steady, her hands clenched as she saw her people stand against the impossible. She did not call for retreat, nor did she show fear. She believed in them, and that belief carried into every man and woman who fought below. Daniel felt it with each heartbeat, and it drove him forward, even when his body screamed to stop. At last, the rival coalition made a final push, gathering all remaining forces into one overwhelming charge. The ground shook as they advanced, their numbers blotting out the field. Daniel stood at the front lines, his squad behind him, and raised his weapon high. Laura gave the final order, directing every fighter into position. The clash was like thunder. Steel met steel, cries filled the air, and the field turned into chaos. Yet through the chaos, Daniel's squad held. They fought with every ounce of strength left in them, every breath a refusal to surrender. When the final horn sounded, the battlefield froze. Silence filled the hall. The coalition was broken, their army scattered. Daniel stood at the center, his chest heaving, his body torn, but his spirit unbroken. Laura stepped down from the command post, joining him. The queen raised her hand, and the crowd erupted in a roar that shook the walls. Humanity had done the impossible. They had entered as underdogs, mocked and doubted. They had endured every trial, faced every trap, and risen against every force. Now they stood as victors. Across the stars, men and women spoke in awe of the Deathworlders who had refused to bend. Their story was no longer a contest. It was legend, carved into history forever.